Welcome back to Extra Literary Affairs, a podcast for the lit curious reader, because why not read a little bit of everything? I'm Jennifer Smith.
And I'm Joey Kelly.
And today we are kicking off a month-long journey through one of the most universal and perhaps least understood experiences of human life. Over the next 4 weeks, together we will travel across continents and centuries, sitting with the bereaved, the mourning, the heartbroken, the forgotten, examining how different cultures and different eras have made sense of grief and what those differences reveal about what it means to be human. Why are we exploring grief here, and why now? Those are great questions, Joey. Why now? One thing that every human being who has ever lived shares. It's not language, it's not religion, it's perhaps not even love, at least not in the same form, but loss. The experience of losing something or someone that mattered, and in that loss, grief. Grief is, at its core, the emotional response to loss. But loss takes more forms than most of us recognize until it arrives at our own door. There's bereavement grief, the kind we most readily name and are most familiar with, through the death of a parent, a partner, a child, a friend. There is anticipatory grief, which is a mourning that begins before a loss even happens. People who have dealt with a terminally ill parent or spouse, for example, will have anticipatory grief. The slow goodbye is excruciating. The diagnosis that reconfigures a future you had already imagined. Then there is disenfranchised grief. Grief that society does not always recognize or validate. It's very low-key, under-the-radar grief. We don't throw a party. We don't have a celebration. Perhaps the grief of a miscarriage or the grief of losing a beloved pet, a grief of a relationship that was a secret or complicated, or one that others thought you should never be in and should definitely be over by now. There is collective grief, the mourning of communities, nations, and peoples. I think we will explore this in the poem we're about to read, Joey. Collective grief is the grief that follows war, famine, genocide, natural disaster, disappointment in government, the kind of grief that reshapes cultures and births new rituals almost overnight. And we'll end, Joey, with our description of the types of grief and the types of grieving we as a society may encounter is cumulative grief. It is loss upon loss upon loss, the kind that doesn't pause to let you breathe before the next wave arrives, the kind that many communities living on the margins of history have known intimately century after century. And Joey, I will say right now, in March of 2026, living in America at this moment, I am feeling the weight of this collective grief. It seems like we just can't get our feet under us without another tragedy, without another disappointment, without another shocking development in the news. So I'm just really rooted in the idea of, do we need more talk about sadness and grief and darkness and heaviness right now? And the reason I wanted to explore this was to hopefully remind ourselves that we will get through this. We get through everything. We will get through this. It's not the first go round. Why do you want to talk about grief now, Joey?
I think what you said about how this is this universal emotion that doesn't need translation and that it crosses all cultural divides. Doesn't matter what culture you come from, you will experience grief in some way. Even if it's on the list that you just read, those amounts of types of grief, I don't know them all, but I think it's important for us to see that this is a uniting factor. This is something that I think is probably the most universal. As I was trying to think about what is something that everyone that is alive today shares during their lifetime. It's something that doesn't need to be explained. If you see someone grieving, you understand intrinsically what is happening. You don't need to know what happened to cause their grief, but you understand what it feels like to do that. It just doesn't need all of the explanation. But if you see someone that's laughing at a movie or something and you're not laughing, then you need an explanation as to why something would be funny to that person. So I think happiness and joy can also be universal things, but we chose grief, and so that's what we're sticking with.
It certainly is, Joey, and I would just like to end the introduction with this. What we hope to discover across this series is that grief is not a problem to be solved. It is an experience, as you said. Every person who has been on this planet at any time has experienced loss, either the loss of self, loss of love, loss of life even. Every culture we visit in this month-long tour has tried in its own way to hold grief, to give it shape, to define a duration. What's the appropriate amount of time you should be grieving? How does your community recognize you during your grief process? And what does it mean to grieve? So each episode will take us somewhere new. We're going to different times, places, people, writing styles, different translations, and we're going to be asking ourselves, how did they grieve? And what did that grief mean to them? And more importantly for me, how does their answer to that teach us about our own expression of grief? Grief, it turns out, is not the opposite of love. It is love with nowhere to go, and humanity has spent millennia trying to build a place for it. Joey, I'm really excited to hear you read a poem on this topic by Roque Salas Rivera entitled "And Because You Were Born Here." And after you read the poem, Joey, I would love to give you some additional information about this particular poet and their ties to Philadelphia.
Because we're journeying through the Americas, and because this was inspired by Bad Bunny's Super Bowl performance, we're starting with Puerto Rico. The poet is Puerto Rican. And because you were born here. A billboard announces the construction of the new electric plant next to the basketball court where you play like you study. You are sick. Because they told your parents the stains in the skies were renovations. The proof they offered was the Pentecostal church and its parking. Someone planted a table in the park, offered free tarot, and read that in 2 decades your government would empty your account. You pray and pray your barrio's economic situation will improve. You're answered by machines that offer you numerical options. You know no solution is linear. The GPS sends you down a street that no longer exists, but you memorize beaches and their relations to cement as if these were your history, these your scintillating railway. The elders try to not die despite cancer, and our rulers' persistent hate. You are young and subsidize your life with kites and films. But you also get sick because the water is sick, because the buildings have asbestos, because your feet touch the ground, and you breathe while you sleep. Snaps for poetry.
Joey, thank you so much. And one thing we have discussed in previous episodes is that we are using this poem, which is in the public domain. It is widely available on the internet, and we want to be sure to give credit where credit is due. So just a little PSA on that. We are using this in the common sense. We are not appropriating this person's poetry. Joey, I had never heard of this poet before. I looked him up and found some background and a tie to Philadelphia, which I'm living outside of at this point. Salas Rivera was born in 1985 in Puerto Rico. So you were right on that the Puerto Rican heritage is very near and dear to his heart. Salas Rivera identifies as non-binary and uses he, him, and they, them pronouns. He holds a PhD in comparative literature and literary theory from the University of Pennsylvania and was named the 4th Poet Laureate of Philadelphia in 2018. He currently lives and teaches in Puerto Rico. He writes in both Spanish and English, focusing on the experiences of being a migrant to the United States, the colonial status of Puerto Rico, and queer Puerto Rican identity. He is the author of 6 full-length poetry collections, which have been longlisted and shortlisted for the National Book Award, the PEN America Open Book Award, and the CLMP Firecracker Award. Joey, there is a long family legacy. His grandfather, Soltera Rivera Avils, was a Puerto Rican poet, and his mother, linguist Yolanda Rivera Castillo, making poetry something of a family tradition. So, Joey, thank you so much for tying this back to Bad Bunny and the Super Bowl halftime show, reminding us that there is more to the Americas than just the United States of America.
Yeah. And before we get into the actual topic of today, I think we have talked in this episode so far and our previous one about how music is also a universal language, and poetry is as well. You don't need to be able to understand what music is saying or what poetry is literally saying to have it evoke emotion. That's something that Jorge Luis Borges wrote about, that he would read people poems in Spanish, and so it doesn't matter that you don't know Spanish. That's irrelevant to this conversation. You just have to feel something from it. That's the only requirement from poetry, and I think music is the same thing, that you don't need to understand what these artists are saying if you don't speak their language. You just have to enjoy the music itself and just feel something. Okay, that's it. Okay, so because we're talking about Puerto Rico and Uruguay today. So for Puerto Rico, of course, we got to say Bad Bunny. Up on the screen are some songs by Bad Bunny. I think he's the most listened to person on Spotify and apps like that. Or if he's not, he's up there. So I doubt that anyone has not heard his music by now. But if you have not, please check it out. Okay. And for Uruguay, I actually had to do a decent amount of research for this because I am completely unaware, a huge gap in my knowledge, okay? And I freely admit that. So I had to look it up. And my hesitation is to be like, oh my God, what if this person is not super popular? So I'm rolling the dice. I did enough research. Her name is Natalia Oreo. Hopefully I said that right. Okay. And she seems to be pretty popular for a really long time. She's an actress, a model. She's a jack of all trades. So I'll put some of her songs on the screen, which are available on YouTube and I'm sure other streaming platforms as well. And it seems like some of her movies are very nostalgic for people. And she's been around for a really long time. So check her out. Check out her music. I enjoyed her music, the ones that I've listened to so far. So hopefully I picked a good singer for Uruguay.
Awesome, Joey. I do appreciate that. And I am going to make a wild assumption because I have not listened to the songs yet, but I am very much looking forward to checking them out. She is singing in Spanish?
Yeah. So is Bad Bunny.
Awesome. So, to your original point, even if you do not speak Spanish, you may speak the universal language of music, emotion, feeling. If you're feeling something, you're doing it right. So, I look forward to checking that out. So, Joey, we are going to transition now to the short story that we picked to discuss today by Uruguayan writer Horacio Quiroga, and it is called The Feather Pillow, and it was written in 1907 and published in 1917 in a collection. Never heard of this person. I think the average American, myself included, may have a little difficulty drawing a map of South America and pointing to where this country actually exists. So if you haven't looked for the location, you can check it out. I think we are all in for a little bit of education there.
It's right between Brazil and Argentina.
I was just going to say it is adjacent to Argentina because this writer, while born in Uruguay, a lot of time in his life was spent in Argentina. So I will read his official bio that we have pulled together. Horacio Quiroga was from Uruguay and he was born in 1878. He led a life that was as dramatic and shadowed as the fiction he produced. He wrote a lot about tragedy, the wilderness, and an almost fatalistic obsession with death, which mirrored his own experience. So from the very first months of his life, death was never far from his side. His father died in a shooting accident before Horatio could walk. His stepfather shot himself in front of him when Horatio was 18. 2 for 2 now. Father figures not really working out. A few years later, he accidentally shot and killed his best friend. He was jailed, cleared, and then eventually left Uruguay forever, vowing never to return. These experiences left an indelible mark on his psyche and his prose. I would go so far as to refer back to our earlier conversation about compounded grief. This guy just really couldn't catch a break. He later moved to the remote jungle regions in northeastern Argentina, where he lived for an extended period. He farmed, he wrote, and he spent a lot of time in near isolation. The jungle became both his subject and his spiritual landscape, a place of savage beauty, indifferent nature, and human fragility. His stories draw heavily upon some authors that we have talked about here on this channel, Edgar Allan Poe and Kipling, which blended psychological horror and vivid naturalism. His most celebrated collections, which are in Spanish, but I will use the English translation, Tales of Love, Madness, and Death in 1917, in which the story we're reading today appears, and his 1918 collection, South American Jungle Tales, showcased his gift for building tension, his preoccupation with madness and mortality, and his rare ability to render the natural world as both magnificent and merciless. Sadly, Joey, he died in Buenos Aires in 1937. He chose to end his life after being diagnosed with cancer. He drank a glass of cyanide and
woof, that's a way to
his
go.
end. but something very beautiful and positive about his career is Quiroga's influence on Latin American literature is profound. Writers, including your guy, Joey Borges, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, credit him with influencing their works. And I'll end here, Joey, because I thought this was quite interesting and also indicative of Edgar Allan Poe in the English tradition, that he wrote something called, and it has two names in translation, the Decalogue of the Perfect Short Story Writer, alternately known as 10 Commandments for the Perfect Storyteller. I happen to prefer that title. A 10-point manifesto, which was published in 1925 on the art of the short story, and that remains a touchstone for writers across the Spanish-speaking world. So if you're looking for a blueprint of how a story should be composed, they're probably going to use the 10 Commandments that he put out into the world. So Joey, is there any person that his background sort of echoes to you that we've spoken about?
Other than Edgar Allan Poe?
Just Poe.
So I saw a lot of Angela Carter in this story.
All right.
Don't worry, I feel like I'm going to sell it. Don't worry about it.
I never worry about you selling it to me, Joey. There's usually a thread that I have missed that you will pick up. And Joey, do you want to tell us what the Feather Pillow story is all about?
Sure. It was first published in 1907 and then was later part of the collection in 1917, The Tales of Love, Madness, and Death. Okay. Catchy title. The story follows a young newlywed couple. Now I'm going to say these as you would say it in English, okay? So Alicia and Jordan. Okay, I'm 100% sure that's not how you would pronounce it, but we're just going to say it for ease of our conversation. So Alicia and Jordan, whose marriage is cold from the start. Jordan is a reserved, almost distant man, and Alicia, sensitive and gentle, finds their grand marble-floored house more like a tomb than a home. She loves him, but feels that his love is something remote and unexpressed. Shortly after the wedding, Alicia falls mysteriously ill. She grows pale, weak, and increasingly feverish, wasting away with no clear diagnosis. Doctors are baffled. She suffers hallucinations, sees monstrous figures lurching toward her from the carpet, and deteriorates rapidly. Within weeks of her wedding, she is dead. Then comes the story's unforgettable final turn. After her death, a servant notices the feather pillow Alicia had been sleeping on, and it's extraordinarily heavy. When they cut it open, they find a horrifying discovery hidden inside, a massive, bloated, parasitic creature that had been feeding on Alicia's blood through her temple every night as she slept, growing fat while she died. The story works on multiple levels. On the surface, it's Gothic horror, precise, economical, and deeply unsettling, but many readers and scholars also read it as a metaphor, the cold, suffocating marriage, the husband who drains his wife of life while she wastes away loving him, and a monstrous truth hiding in the most intimate domestic object imaginable, her own pillow. Quiroga's style is restrained, clinical in its detail, and devastating in its final image. The horror feels biological and inevitable, which makes it all the more disturbing.
Indeed, it does, Joey. And I do not recall mentioning that this was obviously written in Spanish and we were reading a translation. So we often talk about what is gained or lost in translation. So take that in consideration. What were your initial impressions when you first read the story? This is very short, right? It's about 4 pages.
Yeah, it's very short. So you could read it in 10 minutes or something. It depends on how fast you can read. So I really like the story, and I think it was effective as a Gothic horror story, as we mentioned, because obviously we've been talking a lot about Edgar Allan Poe. And I think Quiroga really doesn't give us an exact answer, because I wasn't sure if this was supposed to be speculative. Is this a mythological creature that they find, or is this reality? Is this a real thing that exists somewhere in the world? Is it a type of bug or something like that? Is it a bat? What is it? But we don't know. We don't get the answers. That was an ambiguous ending to me, even though we see the thing, but it's not an accurate description of it. And I think he does a really great job of creating the Gothic atmosphere when he describes Jordan's house. Specifically, I think this could fit anywhere in the Gothic genre and tradition. I was saying before how this sort of reminded me of Angela Carter's The Bloody Chamber, because we have a young woman who's coming into a new home and she's transitioning from her adolescence to her adulthood, and she has to have this journey of self-discovery. It's not as fleshed out as, of course, The Bloody Chamber is, because it's much shorter, but the process is still happening where Alicia has to come in and face reality that her life may not be the fairy tale that she has in her head as she's been growing up. And that's it. And I'll end it there. That's my initial impression.
Thank you, Joey. I didn't exactly know what to make of this story. I didn't read any of the history, just take the story at face value and see where it goes. So the fact that the writer, at least in the translation that we read together, talks about some of these fairy tale elements. They actually used fairy tale romance. It felt like this cold marble, snowy, Snow White, sleeping princess vibe. And I was like, well, that's curious that this was written in 1907 and it feels very contemporary. It's all of the fairy tale romances. And when you said she's getting very pale, she seems anemic, it's like, is her husband a vampire? Is somebody draining the life out of her? Because the doctor comes, he's like, there's no reason for her to not be well. Just sleep on it. I'm sure she'll be fine in the morning. Call me if she's not. And then the writer says, not only was she not the same, she was remarkably worse. I thought that was really interesting. And I didn't know, because again, this is in translation, what current view to put on it. Did she have a blood disorder? Was there a reason? What was going on? And then the visceral, when they open the pillow, which is this domestic bliss, like you put your little head, you're so safe, you're snug as a bug in a rug, right? You're very cozy in bed. And I open the pillow, I can just see this big bloated tick-like thing coming out. And I was like, oh, this is so disgusting. Why did you do this to me? I had a more of a disgust response to the revealing of that creature than I do perhaps with some of the brutality and some of the odd things in Edgar Allan Poe. And I just thought it was very interesting that Poe was one of his major inspirations and somebody that he really looked up to. Joey, I think it deserves mentioning that this writer has published at least 200 short stories. So he was incredibly prolific. He was also a journalist. They said some of his writing is clinical and cold like journalism, but then his creativity comes through and his storytelling and his fiction. So I thought that was also just a very interesting blend.
Yeah, I think you could see it in this story because we're not really supposed to connect with the characters. Obviously, it's not that long. Not that you can't connect with characters in such a short amount of time. Depends on what the author is trying to do. But yeah, this felt more clinical, as you said. He's telling us what has happened.
And Joey, when you said, what does this remind you of? What stories that have we read together? The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, because when she's hallucinating and she sees things coming out of the carpet, I was like, oh no, 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 no. What is happening? I'm going with the CDC on this one. This could be a tick-borne illness, right? So if this is really what was happening with her, maybe it did inject her with some sort of substance that did create these hallucinations in her, because I'm not a doctor. I don't play one on TV, but I do not believe that blood loss is a reason for people to start having hallucinations about things crawling out of the floorboards and out of the carpet.
Literally have no idea. Good question, though. Could that lead to visual hallucination? I have no idea. Someone's got to ask a doctor. To tie this back into how this explores grief, we have two main characters who are both exploring different types of grief. We have Alicia, who is grieving the idea of her marriage not being as she had imagined in her head. We know that she is pretty young, and this is probably her first adult experience. I'll read the very beginning, the first few lines, just so we can have an idea of who this character is. Since it's so succinct, we don't get that much information. So, Alicia's entire honeymoon gave her hot and cold shivers. A blonde, angelic, and timid young girl, the childish fancy she had dreamed about being a bride had been chilled by her husband's rough character. She loved him very much, nonetheless, although sometimes she gave a little shudder when they returned home through the streets together at night. She cast a furtive glance at the impressive stature of her Jordan, who had been silent for an hour. He, for his part, loved her profoundly, but never let it be seen. We get this idea that she is pretty young. She's having childish fantasies. She's described as having a childish face and being very angelic. So we get this idea that she's very innocent. And so that's why I was comparing it to Angela Carter's Bloody Chamber, because this young woman is now in a liminal space where she is out of her adolescence and her childhood, but she's not fully in her adulthood yet because she still has to learn. There has to be lessons learned in order to grow up and become an adult. So she's stuck in this transitory space in the story that she never comes out of because she dies before she can fully grow as an adult. I mean, I think she does learn eventually to accept Jordan as he is and says like, okay, well, you're probably not going to be the most affectionate husband I would have dreamed of, but all right, it is what it is. And then I was saying with Jordan that he is exploring his grief of losing his wife. And I think he also has to grieve that he never was able to express his emotions to her fully.
Yeah, Joey, I appreciate that. And I'm going to read from the text here. For 3 months, they had been married in April. They lived in a special kind of bliss. Okay, that sounds great. You start the story that she's young and innocent, but the way she describes her husband and this marble house and the cold floors, her husband feels like a statue. He is unmoved by her. He's cold. He's big. He is silent. Okay, that's interesting. So that gave me also a little bit of like Dracula vibes. There was just something distant and removed. And what really struck me, and I'm going to read this passage, Alicia passed the autumn in this strange love nest. She had determined, however, to cast a veil over her former dreams and live like a sleeping beauty in the hostel house, trying not to think about anything until her husband arrived each evening. So that death of her innocence, the death and grieving of her childhood fantasies of how awesome it's going to be married. And she's like, I'm kind of married to a stone cold, distant dude, and I stay home all day, not thinking about anything, just sort of emptying my mind, waiting for my quote unquote real life to start when my husband gets home. And so the fact that the author put in here, lived like a sleeping beauty, just really struck me on all of these things we've talked about in the past about storybook fairy tale romance and how harmful it is when your storybook fairy tale romance butts up against the realities of most people's lived lives. And I just thought that was really interesting. She was robbed of her childhood fantasy versus the reality of marriage to this man. I'm not saying you can't have a fairy tale storybook romance, but that's not the romance she received.
Yeah, she learned quick that she's like, I love you so much. Let's just like go home and watch a movie and cuddle. And he's like, no, we're actually not going to do that.
I'm so shut down.
Sorry about
but
that,
when
Alicia.
he sees her getting sick, then he suddenly like gets on board and he seems to be more involved with her and more concerned in expressing his love. And it was like, really? You gotta wait until I'm literally on death's door before you realize like, oh, right, this is my wife. I should probably like her. I just thought it was very, very interesting.
Yeah, he starts to experience that anticipatory grief that you were talking about in the beginning. And I love the way that Quiroga writes this part. So he says, with tireless persistence, he paced ceaselessly from one end of the room to the other. The carpet swallowed his steps. At times he entered the bedroom and continued his silent pacing back and forth alongside the bed, stopping for an instant at each end to regard his wife. So obviously we get some personification in there as well because a carpet cannot swallow something and has no mouth or throat. But I really like that he uses that because I think it's a very Gothic idea to sort of make this household thing become this monster, because you immediately imagine, or at least I did, a mouth forming in the carpet and literally swallowing his foot. But I think he's trying to say is that he was very quiet and so it like stifled the sound. But I think it works on both ways there. It makes you think like there is something amiss. There might be something speculative happening in the house, and maybe the house is more of a character in the story than you initially think, or he's just being very quiet and trying to take care of his wife.
So that takes me back to when we read Ling Ma's story, Los Angeles. The house just created all these rooms for all these old boyfriends to be in. And we also read a story in which the house had agency and it swallowed up the bad guys, the Hollow. So there's a lot of these echoes that came much later of that idea. And Joey, I always really enjoy when we can read something and say, you know what this reminds me of? I know theoretically they're not influencing them backwards in time. They can definitely have a ripple effect forward. But the idea of a house having some agency is so creepy to me that I really enjoy reading those types of literature that we have read in the past. What happens if your house does decide to step in and make a move?
I love a haunted house too. So I would be super excited if that was what this was about. But I think that's what's also interesting is that we can see the influence of literature in so many places. And that's why I was saying like, well, Angela Carter didn't inspire Horacio Quiroga because she's writing after him, so that would be impossible unless he had a time machine. I don't know if Angela Carter read him. I have no idea. Like, how would I even find that information? She just had like a book list of everything she's ever read. But I think it's
We
sort of,
cannot go to her Goodreads account, Joey.
yeah, that'd be helpful. That'd be so nice if we had that for those really big authors like Angela Carter and Borges and Toni Morrison. I would have loved to have like read all her favorite books. Maybe that's listed somewhere. I don't know. But anyway, I just think it's really interesting that we have this like shared idea that is like grief, where it's like these transcend borders. It doesn't matter where you're from because like the ideas in literature just end up everywhere. You could think of mythology with like dragons. Dragons pop up in so many parts of the world that were not connected. There's no way they would have been able to share that part of their mythology, you know, in really early, you know, parts of humanity. How do these ideas spread like that? How do we just, how do we all sort of know like, you know, a vampiric sort of story is spooky? How do we, you know, how do we have like a sentient house? Maybe this house isn't sentient, I don't know, but you know, it's so fascinating to think like these things pop up all over the place without having to like physically explain it to someone or bring that and expose someone to this type of material.
And those fears, Joey, as you said, are universal across time, across geography, across all of these unknowns. So for me, it's somehow, in my view of the world, it's in our wiring. Our brains are wired up to have these experiences. I have heard they've done MRIs of nuns and Buddhist monks and people who are having religious experiences, and they can see a functional MRI that a particular part of their brain lights up when they self-report they are experiencing a religious phenomenon. And so for me, just like fear and these universals come up, I believe that there are certain parts of our circuitry in our brains, what makes us human. It's in the wiring. You can't escape it. And Joey, it was very interesting because in the translation that we had, and neither one of us unfortunately can speak Spanish, I want to read the couple of sentences. I was like, this was so precise about the way in which he described this experience. I wonder if it felt this precise in the Spanish edition. So I will read this. She did not want her bed to be touched, not even to have her bed covers arranged. Her crepuscular terrors advanced now in the form of monsters that dragged themselves toward the bed and laboriously climbed upon the bedspread. And Joey, for me, that was so the idea of the yellow wallpaper and images creeping out of the walls and then terrorizing the person who was in the room and your inability to escape it. So they said that she's anemic. She just keeps getting weaker and weaker. Her mind is having these very vivid hallucinations and she's frozen in her body. She can't escape the fate that is coming towards her. And I just thought that was really quite effective. So for a short story that can leave you with some very creepy vibes, I would definitely recommend this because I did not predict where the story was going to take us. And the ending for me, I was like, why is that the ending? And ew, that's the ending. Gross.
Yeah, I think it really points to something vampiric or parasitic because crepuscular has to do with like resembling twilight. You can see the effects of what happened during the day, but she like tends to be a little bit more alert during the day. So yeah, you get some vampire vibes, definitely some Dracula in there, which maybe he would have read. I'm sure. I don't know how widely available all of these things were. I have no idea. But anyway, interesting idea to look that up, to do some research and see like what is popular throughout the world, what's being translated into Spanish and is available in this part of the world. But I think something else that is very universal is this idea he's sort of making a scapegoat for death. Because I think this is also something that has to do with grief, is that when we lose a loved one, a family member, or a friend, or a pet, because I would obviously grieve a pet, and I have, that it's sort of a natural occurrence to be like, this is what did it. I am mad at this thing. Whether it's like, I'm mad that this person had cancer, I'm mad that this person was shot, or however they died or something. Hopefully they didn't get shot, but obviously that happened. So there's always this idea of like, I want to be mad at something. I have to channel all of this grief and all of this emotion that I'm having that is very overwhelming into this one item. This one, I have to it has to be, pinpointed somehow. And so I think that's what's happening in this story, is that it's being used as a metaphor. And I think that there is some other causes that I think this could have been avoided. I think she was. We don't know her medical history prior to the story because the introduction I read about her is all that we get. We sort of know that there might be a hint that she's maybe suffering from some type of illness because she is said to shudder a lot. If she's anemic, I think anemic people get cold pretty quickly, if I'm not wrong. So maybe she had a history of anemia, and this is why there wasn't too many alarm bells going off, because you're like, oh, okay, well, this is sort of a pattern. It's just something that naturally happens to her. Do they know that at this point in history? Probably not. I don't know. I don't know the history of, anemia here. She is described as being anemic, so I'm assuming they know something about it. But I also think that there is some negligence by the doctor in particular, because she had she had 2 puncture wounds in her temple. You didn't see that? You didn't do an exam. You just kind of walked in, and that were like, well, she's a woman, so she's, it's probably not that bad, or she's hysterical. So, there is a lot of misogyny that I think would have naturally gone into this. I'm not saying that Horacio Quiroga would have been a misogynist, but I think that's part of the reason why this goes missed.
I love that you're doing that, Joey, but I will say, as a woman, my hair is covering my temples. So there could be a teeny tiny little thing right there. And if I'm in my bed with my hair down, you may not see it. But I love the idea that you brought up, which is still happening today, 2026. Hello, everyone. That women often are not believed when they talk to their doctors about what is physically happening to them. If it cannot be seen or explained, sometimes it doesn't get heard. And I am very sure that in 1907, they probably didn't have any advanced ways to determine if she's anemic. What would they do if she had anemia? I recently have learned about this condition by speaking to someone else, and it was someone who was like, I'm a doctor, I should have known better, but I couldn't diagnose my own issue for myself. So I just thought that was really quite interesting to think, what were the medical technologies available if they even wanted to believe her?
Yeah, that's the kicker. Do they believe? And there's really no one there to advocate for her, because just like in the Bloody Chamber, their protagonist is isolated. She's in this big old house, and there's really no one else except for her husband and this maid or this staff to be like, oh, hey, something's wrong. Like, you're wrong, doctor. Because he also doesn't have a history. We don't know how they met. So we don't know. We know that they're married for 3 months, but we don't know how this all happens. Is this like an arranged marriage? Is this like it was love at first sight, or what is going on? I doubt it was love at first sight. So I sort of get the idea that he doesn't know anything about his wife because he's not invested anyway. Okay. And so there would be no reason for him to really be able to advocate for her, because he doesn't have all this medical history. Like, where's her family? Where's her parents? Where did she come from? How far away is that? Like, why is no one here to help visit her? Why does none of her family come visit her when she's sick? Does he not communicate with her, her family, if her family is still alive or is close by? So I think that's a mark of great literature. Obviously, we do not get any of those questions answered in this story. It's so short, but I think it's a mark of great literature, as I said, because these are all the things that I was immediately starting to think of. It's like, well, where are all the people? Where are the people at in this story? We need to know more. Well, we don't need to know. It's a complete story as it is, but I think it's interesting that it begs these questions.
Joey, and I appreciate that, because we do have more questions. But I was like, Joey, have you never seen a storybook romance? You meet somebody, your eyes lock across the room. It is love at first sight. Her big, tall, strong, princely man swoops her away from her family, puts her in her home, and apparently sucks the life out of her, and she dies quickly. But that is a different part of the storybook romance.
Man.
But it was just that funny thing. And as you were talking about sort of the ways in which fears are manifest, or how certain symbols are manifest across cultures that probably did not have any other way to transmit that information, dragons being one of them. They show up in a lot of different cultures that are very separate. I was also thinking about this idea because we did read the science fiction story, and you're going to remind me what it is, where the males get impregnated by these big ant-like creatures. Remember
Blood
that
child.
story? Blood child, right? They were turning the script on who's the host, who's the victim, who survives, who doesn't. And this idea of a parasite, it was living externally from her, but it did suck her blood like a vampire and rob her of her strength. In 1907, in Latin America and in all cultures, women had a very high propensity to die in childbirth, right? It was not a guarantee that you were going to get through it. So I don't have any children and I haven't experienced this, but I have a lot of people in my life who have, to think, is a baby also like a parasite? It grows inside you, it takes nutrients from you. If you have preeclampsia, as my girlfriend did, she's like, my baby tried to kill me before she even came out. I'm like, that's not real. And I looked, I'm like, right, there was something going on in there, and you two were no longer compatible, and that baby either was going to come out or you as the mother was going to die. So it was just such an interesting play on that dynamic of externalization of fear versus the internalization of how you want to deal with that. Just thought
Yeah.
it was curious.
And it sort of makes me think, like, as Alicia is being drained of her life, her literal life force, her blood, that Jordan starts to come into his own and is like able to express emotion. So is this like a metaphor of like women have to do the emotional labor? I'm against men, down with the patriarchy. That's where this is going.
You'll only love me 3 minutes before I die. Great. What does a girl have to do around here?
Okay, so next week we're going to be reading a story called Fish, Turtle, Vulture by a Bolivian author named Giovanna Rivero.
Thank you for joining me on this grief journey. And I'm really curious about this Bolivian point of view.
Okay, bye.
See you next week.